Welcome everybody. Welcome to the new folks. First of all, I want to thank Peter for that wonderful overview. A number of the themes that he's introduced in his presentation offer a really perfect bridge for what I want to talk about. I'm going to try and focus on some of the emerging trends in cooperation, some of the challenges that the cooperative movement is facing, and try to connect that to a couple of key themes. One being an area in which cooperatives are playing an increasingly important role as a new trend, and that's in the provision of social care, healthcare, social care, and various aspects of that. And then secondly, which is a theme that Michel will be extrapolating on over the course of this conference, is the connection between the cooperative model and the reemergence of the commons movement as a very, very important dynamic in how people are beginning to rethink not only issues, local issues like community development, but also how the technology of our age is impacting and transforming how enterprises work, and what are the consequences and implications of technology on things like economic development, social development, and in particular the cooperative model. So I believe that the cooperative movement today is at an important crossroads. As Peter pointed out, there's a long and rich and powerful history in the cooperative movement, not only here in Ireland and the UK, but around the world. But there are issues that have emerged over the course of the last 160, 70 years in the co-op movement. And one of the issues is some confusion and some ambivalence around the co-op identity, around what is the role of the cooperative model and cooperatives as social change agents. In other words, not only as a model for successful enterprise development and community development, but in a broader frame, what is the role of cooperatives as structures and organizations that actually push for political change and the altering of the political framework and the larger corporate framework within which we all live and work. And what is the role and what is the vision of cooperatives and cooperative leaders for the movement in terms of the future, the long-term role that the cooperative movement and cooperatives will play in transforming the economic, social, and political order of our times. And I think this is absolutely fundamental. And it is sometimes not what is at foremost in the minds of some of the larger and most successful cooperatives. And within the movement, certainly I think the case in Canada, I worked in the cooperative movement in Canada for over 20 years. And what I witnessed over time is this increasing polarization and inequality within the cooperative movement. So there is an increasing divergence of interests and culture, I would say, between the large, very successful cooperatives in the financial services industry, in the insurance industry, certainly in the retail sector. Witness, for example, the very serious troubles of the cooperative bank, the cooperative group in the UK, which is ongoing, of course. And the emergence of such powerful, dynamic, visionary, enterprising, small and medium-sized cooperatives that, for example, we'll be hearing about soon, as in the case of Maeve, and the work that's going on here in Ireland and many other places. Some of the most visionary and innovative and forward-thinking cooperatives are, in fact, the new, small, emerging cooperatives, but too often they remain at the margins of the cooperative movement. They don't have the voice and the profile within the mainstream movement that they deserve, right? So these are serious questions. And unless they are dealt with in a forthright way, in an open way within the mainstream cooperative movement, I think the future doesn't look as promising and as powerful as it could for the cooperative model, and that's a serious issue. There are a number of tendencies that I think that have emerged within the cooperative movement, and I've identified 4 key ones to my mind. One is the tendency now for large, established and successful cooperatives to become very large, to become international organizations, many of them having transnational operations across Europe and internationally. So groups like the Mondragon Cooperative Group in Spain, some of the large Italian multinational co-ops, international cooperative banks and international cooperative insurance companies like Rabobank and Cooperators Insurance from Canada. These have become multinational organizations. And that carries with it a whole set of challenges that have not really yet been solved. And they need to be solved if, in fact, the cooperative model is going to contend with large global corporations for success and for the allegiance of communities and their membership, certainly, in a global marketplace. Demutualization. As cooperatives increase in size and increase in scale, the pressures of that kind of scale of operation, the capital demands that are required to operate at multinational levels, exerts a whole range of dynamics within those large cooperative structures that make it very, very difficult for them to maintain a strong cooperative identity and a strong cooperative culture within those organizations. And so very often what happens is the influence of size and the influence of capital for operating those large-scale organizations push towards demutualization, push towards those organizations issuing shares, joining the capital markets of the capitalist economy, and in a sense hollowing out the cooperative relationships that exist and are the foundation of cooperatives between members and the organization, right? So they demutualize and they become private for-profit, shareholder-owned corporations. And that is a major problem. In Canada, as in Ireland, the cooperative model has been extraordinarily important in the agricultural economy, in rural community development, and was really the mainstay of farmers' incomes for decades in Canada. And those cooperatives, those large agricultural cooperatives, became major organizations. Almost all of them now have demutualized and been absorbed into the capitalist system. 2 other key tendencies are the emergence of social co-ops. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the rise of social and solidarity cooperatives, health cooperatives, community service cooperatives, whose mission and mandate is the provision of services not just to their own members, but to the broader community. And this could be in the form of environmental work, in the form of community development work, in the form of the provision of health care and other social care services that are aimed at benefiting the community as a whole, not just their own members. And that is an advance on the traditional co-op model, which primarily had as its focus service to its own members. And that's an important, I think, innovation and has important consequences and possibilities for even larger scales and for other kinds of service. And then finally, the emergence of commons and solidarity startups. I'll give us an example. My own home country, I was born in Greece. And over the past few years, as we all know, Greece has been going through a traumatic, catastrophic economic and social crisis. And what has emerged in Greece is a form of constructive response to the economic and social crisis, with the reemergence of a vibrant, active social and solidarity economy, and the use of cooperative models to provide what I would call solidarity services to organizations and groups of people that are suffering from the lack of very basic services like healthcare, like access to food, like access to shelter, and so on. So the social solidarity economy in Greece is using the cooperative model in solidarity with those people and those communities that had been hollowed out and destroyed, really, by the current austerity measures imposed on Greece as a result of this economic crisis. So, the key issues that I have sort of identified in my mind, at least for the large co-ops, are the challenges of growth and of scale, how to address those challenges and still maintain a vibrant cooperative identity and culture. The rise of corporate organizational standards and cultures within these large organizations. The challenge of capital. Large multinational organizations require large pools of capital to operate and to compete in the marketplace. How do they deal with accessing this capital? And then once they have access to it, the influence of capital in the culture of the organization. More and more of these large cooperatives recruit their senior management, their senior executive officers, their managers and directors and so on, not from within the cooperative movement, but from their competition and from the mainstream capitalist economy. Well, this has consequences, obviously. When you start importing senior managers that have little or no understanding or commitment to the cooperative idea, then you have problems at the senior level in terms of maintaining cooperative identity and cooperative culture. This is a major issue. Disconnection from membership. Again, large scale requires very careful attention and innovative strategies to maintain relevance to local members of the larger cooperative. How do you do that? And one of the results has been a gradual disconnection of local membership from the cooperative itself, and this basically undermines the foundation of cooperatives, making it that much easier then for them to become much more corporate and in fact demutualize and stop being cooperatives altogether. The absence of political identity. More and more large cooperatives are concerned with maintaining their position and growing within the industries that they operate, within the markets that they have to compete in, and their political role evaporates. They do not see themselves as political organizations or as organizations with a political social mission beyond simply running a successful enterprise. And this has, of course, consequences when those organizations, in fact, define the culture of cooperative movements nationally, which then remain outside of the primary political and social debates that they desperately need to engage in if they're to remain relevant politically. And then, of course, the absence of cooperative identity. For many, many years, I worked in both Ontario and British Columbia to get the cooperative movement to pay attention to the vital and central importance of identifying themselves as cooperatives and as a distinct form of economic and social organization within British Columbia, for example. And it was very, very difficult. Very difficult, because too many cooperatives see their identity strictly in terms of their own business and their own market, and are unwilling, in a sense, to share their branding and their marketing with other cooperatives within the movement to convey a collective cooperative idea that has significance and power and meaning to people, both inside the cooperative movement and outside. And then, of course, for small and medium cooperatives, there are a whole set of challenges which are typical of them. There's problems accessing capital and accessing training for their staff, for their managers, the absence of entrepreneurial and managerial skills, too many small and medium-sized cooperatives don't have access to institutional supports that actually provide the kind of training that is necessary for running a cooperative and for running a successful business. And then very often you have public policy and legislative changes where governments simply don't recognize or don't pay attention to the potential of cooperatives and for crafting policies that actually support the growth of the cooperative movement as a key element within the broader social and economic development that government should be supporting at both local, regional, and national levels. And then I would say the growing alienation from mainstream co-op institutions on the part of small and medium-sized co-ops. There's a very high-profile international summit that's going to be organized next month in Quebec City. I was at the one that was organized 2 years ago during International Year of Cooperatives. Very imposing, very impressive event. It's hard not to be impressed by the scale and the sophistication and the professionalism of these events. But it's simply out of reach for most cooperatives are not going to pay the registration cost to attend an event like this. How much do you remember? It was a couple of $1,000s or even more? $1,500 just for their registration. We're not talking about travel, we're not talking about accommodation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these small co-ops, which as I said earlier, I think are very often at the front end of the innovation and the vision that fuels the cooperative idea, they don't see themselves represented in this event, in many other events like this. So they ask themselves, what's the connection between, and who's there? I mean, it's the large corporate cooperatives that have the main stage and a spotlight in that event. And so some fundamental questions have to be asked about, who is this event for? Who does it really represent? And so that to me is a major issue. Okay, so these are some of the issues that I think are at play within the cooperative movement and for large co-ops and for small co-ops. The other thing, I just want to close on this section, is that there's a whole range of emerging new areas of development for cooperatives. They include food, local food systems, for example, organics, shared farming and agricultural co-ops that make farming accessible not just to those with large capital that is usually required to operate a farm, but collective and cooperative forms that allow small people with not a lot of money, but with an interest in farming and coming together and using a cooperative structure to operate a farm. In the area of social care and health care and community service, the rise of co-ops that address environmental issues, environmental stewardship and services to the environmental industry, whether we're talking about solar technology or the emergence of wind turbines and cooperatives that operate those. For example, in Germany, a very high proportion of the wind energy enterprises are community-owned, cooperatively structured enterprises, so energy. The point that Peter was alluding to, this very important area for rural development, small business succession and rescue. Thousands and thousands of family-owned businesses. Once the owners want to retire, they want to move on to something else, there's nobody there to take them up. And so you have the disappearance of viable and vital small businesses and shops and so on that are disappearing from rural communities because there's no one there to take them on, and cooperatives are being organized as a strategy for succession for these businesses. And that can take the form of worker co-ops where the business could be sold to the employees of that business, or a collection of people who invest in it from the local community through a co-op and then organize to save that business or that pub or that local shop. The rise of cooperative capital. There's a lot of examples of communities coming together to use co-ops to raise capital for reinvesting in local economic and social development. And this can range from investing in the generation of a healthcare cooperative or a childcare co-op, or in the support of an enterprise or the development of new service for the community in, it could be energy, it could be agricultural services, it could be any range of things. But cooperative capital is a very important sector where new co-ops are being formed for that purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, solidarity services in communities that are facing severe economic and social crisis, as in the case of Greece. I don't know that I'll spend much time on this because I know Michel's going to address this, but there is the rise of this idea of open cooperatives and open cooperativism. What I alluded to earlier in the example of social co-ops is that you have a model of cooperativism where the purpose of the co-op is a social mission or a community mission that includes members but extends to the community as a whole. And social co-ops in Italy and solidarity co-ops in Quebec are an example of this kind of open cooperativism. But there are opportunities for a much larger and a much more ambitious scale for the use of open cooperatives, especially when we talk about the emergence of new forms of commons. The online, so the digital commons, the internet, the open source community, these are new forms of commons that require a structure and a framework that not only protects the culture of commons within those online and sort of cyber communities, but also is a mechanism for expanding them and growing the commons in other areas as well. And so the cooperative model, I think, has a very practical and concrete relevance for strengthening and expanding the way in which new forms of commons are being organized. But how this actually works is a challenge. Thinking about a cooperative in cyberspace and in the material space and at a global level entails very different things than a group of people coming together to purchase a local pub. The relationships between the members of the cooperative of a local tea room or a local community pub are very direct. People know each other, they talk with each other every day. It's a face-to-face kind of relationship. What is the relationship of members in a digital commons? You know, a group of people that are collaborating for the development of open source software, for example. Their relationship is a very different proposition to that work and to each other than the case of a group of people in a local community that are generating capital and investing in a local pub. So how do you develop the kind of operating rules and develop a collective culture that actually is sustainable in that large immaterial space? That's a fundamental challenge. And it entails, I think, different kinds of practices and a different kind of organizational logic than does the face-to-face relationships of a local community co-op. But that's something that needs to be thought through. Well, I won't, there's a number of co-op challenges, but I've identified some of them. But I will just close on this. How much time do I have left, by the way? Am I finished?
You're okay, keep going.
Yes? Okay. Tell me when I'm finished. All right. I'll close on this. I mentioned earlier that among the emerging trends and the new sectors for cooperatives is this area of social care. This has mushroomed in the last 15 or so years, 20 years. And it coincides with the withdrawal of governments from the funding of public services. It's a huge issue, I know, here in Ireland, as it is in the rest of the UK. The defunding of education, the defunding of healthcare, the defunding of public transportation services, the ones that are left, the defunding of benefits to people with disabilities, the defunding of housing, and so on and so on. And so in Europe, particularly in the late 70s in Italy, there was a rise of cooperatives that were set up to provide services to those people that A, had lost access to these services that were previously provided, or because people were simply dissatisfied with the quality of those services. And this was a big factor. The way in which public services has come to be organized in many places, state-controlled, very bureaucratic, very inflexible, and very unresponsive public services had given rise to a lot of disaffection from a lot of people around the quality of the services that they paid for through their tax dollars. So there arose a movement of social co-ops that addressed both the absence or the withdrawal of public support for social care and to address the question of poor quality. And so this is the city of Bologna in Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy, where a lot of the movement for social co-ops began in the late 70s. Today, over 87% of the social care services that are provided in Bologna, ranging from recreation to youth to elder care to healthcare services and so on, over 87% are provided by social co-ops under contract to the local municipality. This is a phenomenal figure. And the range of services that have become available to people has expanded as a result of the rise of this movement. In particular, the rise of social care services to seniors, to people with disabilities. This is CADIAI, one of the largest worker co-ops actually in Europe. Largely, the members of this are caregivers, professional caregivers, largely women. But social co-ops are also using what is called a multi-stakeholder structure, where more than one stakeholder group are involved in the decision-making and in the control of the cooperative. So it includes employees, it includes the users of these services, the families that actually make use of these social care services, and it includes other community members and supporters and municipalities that are working towards a common purpose that the cooperative provides. So there are today, I think, about 40,000 of these social co-ops that are operating in Italy. And that's a very rough figure, but the number of them has mushroomed exponentially over the last decade. And as I said, they were a response to the demand for new and better social services which were not being provided by the public sector. That doesn't mean that the public sector and governments no longer fund public services. One of the key elements of the social co-op model and the solidarity co-op model in Quebec is that government continues to support through public subsidies, through tax benefits, and so on, the operation of these social co-ops, but that funding is also blended with other forms of fee-for-service for those families that use those services. And usually in these cooperatives, you have a progressive funding structure or fee structure where families that can afford to pay more for the services they receive cross-subsidize those families or individuals that have less capacity to pay. And what that means, blended with public funding, is have a much larger range of services that can be offered to the community than in a conventional, certainly in a for-profit model. I mean, that's a very different proposition. I mentioned this. The last figure that I had, and this may have varied since then, is that social co-ops today in Italy account for something like 13% of Italy's expenditure on social services. And that is probably higher now than when I was writing this. But it is a major part of the social welfare structure now of Italy. And the rise of social co-ops in that country has really revolutionized how people now think about public services and social care. In other words, that they are not exclusively associated with state control and state delivery systems. That governments have the responsibility to provide social care, but they don't have to be the organizations that actually produce it. those services can be contracted with social co-ops that actually provide the provision of care at a level and in a kind of organizational form which is much more flexible, much more responsive, much more rooted in local communities, and most importantly, that conveys control rights over the design and delivery of those services to the people that actually depend on them, right? There's a whole section on legislation. I don't need to go into that, but I'll just close on this, that there's a key role for local authorities and municipalities in this model. That the legislation explicitly recognizes the affinity of purpose between local authorities and social co-ops, and that they both share a community service mission. And the legislation explicitly proposes that municipalities and social co-ops collaborate in their operations to create the models and provide the services that they have a joint mutual interest in supporting. I'll leave it at that. There's a whole other section here on health co-ops, and Japan is a very interesting example of how the co-op model is being used to generate very successful healthcare services. In Japan, over 120 hospitals and clinics are operated as cooperatives in conjunction, in partnership with the consumer co-op movement there. But I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can dig into this and explore these questions in more detail in the breakout session. Thank you.